guys, today we are going to do a factoring review. So I'm basically going to give you a step-by-step list of directions that you should ask in your own head whenever you are asked to factor. We're going to take every factoring strategy that we've learned and we're going to figure out, well, how do we determine if I should use AC method? How do I determine if I should use factor by grouping? We know a lot of factoring strategies. How do we know which one to use? So that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so you're given a polynomial and the directions say fully factor or factor. What do you do? Do I do AC method? Do I do factor by grouping? Here is exactly what you do. You're going to ask yourself two questions. The first question is going to always be, is there an overall GCF? Okay? Always, 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 before you pick a factoring strategy, AC method, factor by grouping, difference of squares. Before you do that, you need to check to see if there's an overall GCF. And if there is, you factor that out first. Okay? Once you've done that, maybe there was an overall GCF and you factored it out, or maybe there wasn't an overall GCF, but you checked. Then you can move into the second question that you ask yourself. How many terms are there in my polynomial? You're going to count the number of terms in your polynomial to determine the appropriate factoring strategy. Maybe it's got 4 terms. Then you would use factor by grouping. If it has 3 terms, if it's a trinomial, we would use the AC method, of course. And then if there's 2 terms, we're probably going to be using difference of squares, but remember when you're using difference of squares, there must be a subtraction sign. Okay, right? So for example, let's say you had x squared minus 1. Here's a 2-term polynomial, a binomial. This is a perfect square and this is a perfect square. And we have our subtraction sign. So we can use difference of squares to factor this. However, if this were a plus sign, even though we still have those 2 perfect squares, this is not going to factor because there's a plus sign here. So that will not factor. Okay, so remember, if you're using difference of squares, be sure to check that you have 2 perfect squares and a subtraction sign. All right? A few notes, if you did factor out an overall GCF in that first step, don't forget to include it in your final factorization. So many people forget to do that. Go back, make sure your GCF is part of your final factorization, and then your factorization should always be in the form of factor times factor. You might have 2 factors, 3 factors, 4 factors, but just make sure you know you're done, you're fully factored when you have factors being multiplied together, okay? So always, the first thing you should always do is ask yourself if there's an overall GCF, and then the second thing you do is count the number of terms in your polynomial to determine the appropriate strategy. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys.